Hi there, and welcome to this digital workshop where you get a chance to build your perhaps first social robot interaction. If you have no programming background, don't be alarmed. This tutorial or this workshop will be just fine for the beginners. If you are a more experienced developer, this can also be a good workshop to start with, as it's a very good introduction to the Furhat skill framework. In this workshop, we will assume that you already have the virtual Furhat up and running. But let me just recap the steps to get the SDK and the Blockly that we will be using up and running. So we also have instructional videos on our YouTube channel where you can follow step-by-step instructions to first then install the SDK launcher. Open the SDK launcher and run the SDK or run the virtual Furhat. And then finally start the Blockly tool that we will be using. When we're inside Blockly tool, I will give you just first a quick intro to the Blockly tool. I can also mention that we have additional videos that go more in depth into the Blockly tool on our YouTube channel as well. And in this workshop, we will be working on a task to create an interaction with a character that greets you, asks how you are, and asks for your name. And if you think this sounds very simple, don't worry. Interactions that are very simple for humans are the most difficult to program well. And there's always tons of details to work on to get a simple interaction like this to be a delightful experience. I have the virtual Furhat up and running here with the animated head down here on the side. So let me start the Blockly skill file. And the Blockly skill file can be downloaded from furhat.io/downloads, the same place where you downloaded the SDK launcher itself. And now we can open the web interface. And I will switch directly to the dashboard where we can monitor our interaction as we are building it. And let me now open the Blockly tool. So here we have the canvas. On the left side here, we have the building blocks that we will be using to create our interaction. And in the center here, we have the canvas to create our interaction. And on the top bar here, we have some controls to use for the Blockly tool. So if I add a save block here, we can test to run this.
Hello.
And let's stop it. I can also just test the selected block without running the entire flow.
Hello.
For saving and loading flows into the Blockly tool, we use the import and export function. So if I would export this, this will then dump a XML file with the flow that I have built into my downloads catalog. And I clear the canvas here, so we have a fresh flow, and then we can now import that flow that we just exported. And now we're back to where we were. The save button here is simply to save whatever you've been working on in the tool here, so it does not get lost when you stop the skill, for example. Let's get into today's interaction. So the first step to greet the user is what we essentially already done here by adding just a say block to say hello. The next step would then be to ask how you are. And we'll do so by adding a trigger, a user trigger. So let me get back to my Blockly flow here. And we'll add a trigger user says something. In this case, we already have predefined here hello, but we can type anything we want here. So this is the very basic trigger. There are different ones that are more complex, and we'll get to them a little bit later on in this workshop. We add a ask block. How are you? But for this trigger, to actually trigger, the robot needs to be listening. Currently, it's not listening because it only spoke. It said hello, but it didn't start listening for any reply from the user. So we can add a block here for listening. So now the robot will actually be listening, and it will be able to trigger this user trigger. And a say block and a listen block is exactly the same as an ask block. And you can see that an ask block, it's not possible to add something after the ask block. Same thing with the listen. I can only add it here in between, before. So let's try this out.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
The next step is to add a response here for, let's say the user says, I feel great, and we want to reply, I'm not too bad myself. We'll add another user trigger of the same type. I feel great. Not too bad myself. Let's test this one as well.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I feel great.
I'm not too bad myself.
The next step for us would be then to ask for the person's name. So let's ask, what is your name? We will add another trigger for picking up what the user says, and we will keep with the simple ones. My name is Maria. So let's try this out and watch the interaction from the dashboard.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I feel great.
I'm not too bad myself. What is your name?
My name is Maria.
Nice to meet you, Maria.
So that interaction went smooth. You can see here that now the robot is idle, which means it's not listening, while when it's listening, it actually says listening here. We can also select here show intent to see that we actually trigger the intent that we defined. We used the very simple intent of just having a single example of what the user says to trigger that action. All right, good job. You now have created an interaction that greets you, asks how you are, and asks for your name. So does that mean we're done now? Of course not. There are plenty more things to do to make this skill a robust and delighting experience. I thought perhaps you would now like to explore a little bit on your own before we get into the more advanced parts of the tutorial. So you can, for example, try to build your flow in another language, maybe play around with adding some face gestures to your robot, or change the script up a little bit. So you can do so using the different building blocks. So you have the different building blocks here. On the face, you have some options to for changing the texture, the skin of the robot. And for speech, here you can select other voices in different languages. And you can, in the home tab here, you can see what textures you have available to choose from, and you can try out a couple of voices that you would like to use. So you can play around a little bit with that if you would like. I will continue on with the task for this workshop. And the first step here is to make the interaction more robust. Right now we have an interaction that works but will fail often. It only responds to exact phrases. There's no flow. The user can say anything, anytime. All actions and triggers are in the same place. This will become just messy and difficult to manage as our interaction grows. And there's no error handling. So in the following steps here, we will break up the interaction into multiple states with transitions in between. We will change our triggers to respond to intents rather than exact phrases. And we'll add some error handling when user is silent or says something that we did not understand. All right. So let's start by breaking up the interaction into multiple states. So breaking up the interaction into different states, we will create 2 more states here. Let's have a start state, and then we will have a how are you state and a what is your name state. And let's break this up. So the robot will start by saying hello, the user reply hello, and then we will ask how are you over here. And the trigger for user, what user says, we will add to this instead, and the trigger here for the user saying their name, we'll add it there. And we will move what is your name to here. And now we will add a transition between the different states. So on state start, when a user says hello, we will transition to the how are you state. And the robot will ask, how are you? And you can reply, I feel great. And the robot will say, I'm not too bad myself. And then it will transition to the next state here. What is your name state? And now this is the exact same interaction, just broken down into different states with transitions in between. And the main difference this makes is that when I'm in the start state here, I will not be able to say I feel great or my name is Maria. That will not trigger any reaction. Those will only trigger when the interaction has moved on to this state. So let's try this.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I feel great.
I'm not too bad myself. What is your name?
My name is Maria.
Nice to meet you, Maria.
Next up for us is to change our triggers to respond to intents rather than exact phrases. So we'll do this by changing some of the building blocks. Let's start by doing the greeting. So here we can find in the list here of different building blocks, we can find this user says with an opening to input an intent. So let's use this one instead. We'll push this one here and we'll delete this one. And here we will use a built-in intent for greetings. And this will work with some of the languages on the robot, but at least definitely for English. And it will recognize the sort of common greeting phrases, hello, hi there, good morning, etc. Next, we are going to change the trigger for I feel great to a trigger with a slot for a custom intent that we will need to define. We will do this with the orange building blocks. So let me jump back here into Blockly. So we will add this trigger user says. We'll move these blocks in here. And we can remove that one. And now we want to define our custom intent. And we will give it a name. Perhaps we'll call it user feeling. Then we will need to give it a couple of examples of different things that the user can say to trigger this intent. So maybe we'll say great. Let's add a couple of more examples. I think that's enough. And now we can add a reference to the intent that we just created that we can slot in here, and then we can select the user feeling. Okay, let's try this.
Hello.
Hello there.
How are you?
I feel great, I have to say.
I'm not too bad myself. What is your name?
My name is Maria.
Nice to meet you, Maria.
Good to mention is when having a few examples like this, having them shorter and more as a keyword will ensure that this intent will be easy to trigger. So no matter what I say, if it includes the word great or pretty good or super or fantastic, this intent will trigger. If I have more overlapping intents, where perhaps great will be used in other places, then I should add more examples with a little bit more information into the intent that I'm actually looking for to trigger. And I might need to just provide a lot more examples then for the intent classifier and the NLU engine to have more things to work with. All right, the next step for us is to change the block here to catch the name of the user. So we want to replace that with an intent that will trigger for the user saying an entity. And in this case, the entity here is the name. So there is a built-in variable for recognizing names. So let's first just replace this user trigger with the generic user trigger. We'll remove this one. And now here in the orange building blocks, we can find a building block for a entity. So we can slot that in directly here. This could then also be slotted in into a custom intent if you want to, but we can also directly slot it into our user trigger block. I mentioned we have a built-in entity for this, the name here, that consists of a list of the 100 or so most common English names. We can make sure that we can call this name, this variable user name. So whatever the user says here, that name will then be stored on a variable that is called username. And we can then use that variable to repeat the name back. So in the utterance block here, we can add a value, and in the value we can add or attach a variable, and we can select that variable to be the username. So we'll remove Maria here, and let's try this interaction again. And this time I'll try to use my own name.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I feel super.
I'm not too bad myself. What is your name?
My name is Nils.
Nice to meet you, Denise.
Almost. I guess Nils is not in the list there of the most common English names, but Denise is. All right, next up, we want to be making the interaction more robust is to add error handling when the user is silent or says something else. So let's start by having the robot play out something when the user is silent. As you know, interactions, you probably heard a lot of interactions where the system will repeat, sorry, I didn't hear you, sorry, I didn't understand that, and repeating this very mechanically, and you feel like you're stuck in a loop. Is not a nice experience, so let's make sure that that never happens in our interaction. And starting by adding triggers for when the user is silent and what should happen then. So starting with the start state here, I will add a trigger for user is silent. And the behavior that I would like for my interaction here, that when the user is silent, I want the robot just to be sort of waiting, leaving the user initiative to the user to greet me. That will trigger the interaction. So I will add a transition to do a re-entry, re-entering back into the state. And if I would run this when the user is silent, the robot would then repeat hello again. I want to avoid that, so I can add a trigger, a trigger in the other here on re-entry. So I will add that up here, and on re-entry I simply just want to do a listen without saying hello. So let's try this out.
Hello.
So you can see now it's sort of on a loop whenever I'm silent, and now that I'm speaking, I should trigger another kind of error.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
But if I say hello,
How are you?
then I will transition further in the interaction. Another important error handling to add is for when user says something that we have not anticipated and we don't have defined a trigger for. It's good to have a general fallback that will pick up and make sure that the conversation is sort of continued on. Typically, we don't want to get stuck and stuck in a loop. So let's add for how are you, let's add that a trigger here for when user says something, and make sure to add this trigger after the user says feeling. If you would add it before, this will catch anything that the user say, and this trigger will never be able to trigger. So let's make sure to add it after. And if user says here, maybe a good response would be to say something like, I think today is going to be a great day. And then we will simply do a transition here to the next state, the what is your name state. And typically this answer would work with sort of anything that the user might say. So if the robot say, how are you? And I'm saying, I feel horrible. I think today is going to be a great day. What is your name? Is a okay response to say. Or if the user says, I feel amazing, which I haven't covered here in my examples, the robot then say this user triggered and triggering, and the robot saying, I think today is going to be a great day. What is your name? Is also sort of viable answer to this in this part of the dialogue. So try to come up with sort of good fallback behavior so that can just keep the flow going without getting stuck here. I notice that in the transition I have here, it's actually a different transition, a call transition instead of a go-to transition. I'm just gonna replace this one with the go-to transition, and we'll perhaps get into the difference between a call and a go-to later on. So let's try this.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I don't know, not doing so well.
I think today is going to be a great day. What is your name?
Will also be important to add a trigger here for user says something to when we ask for the person's name. Perhaps the name was not in the list, and we want to make sure we have a nice behavior for handling that. So we can say something like, I didn't quite catch your name. I like to make sure that to just add another block here just so you can read it more clearly. There's no difference between having these different blocks on top of each other. So I'm just going to call you meat bag. I'll continue on and add a little bit more of these error handlings for when user is silent or when user says something. This is really the part of the work where your creativity comes to shine, and your your experience in creating good scripts and making sure that the flow is not stopped somewhere or the user gets stuck. So making sure that you have proper error handling is very important in your interaction. So let me speed up the video and I can take a little moment to do that. You have now created an interaction that has a good flow, is more dynamic, and handles common errors. So are we done now? No, of course not. We need to make the interaction more natural and a little more delighting. And to make it more delightful, right now we have an interaction that is robust, but it's boring and unengaging. So it does not include any facial gestures. It does not try to look at the user and keep eye contact. It does not have any character traits or funny quirks that makes the character interesting. So in the following steps, we will add smiles and other facial expressions. We will add actions to attend the user and respond when the user enters. And we'll try to give it a little bit more of a character, a little more of a flavor to it. So let's start by adding some more smiles and other facial expressions to our interaction. We can either do so from the face section here. We can choose a simple gesture, just like this. And we can choose a gesture, maybe a regular smile is enough. If you want to test out how the gestures look like, you can do so from the Home tab here. We can try out a couple of different gestures. And so on. We can change the gestures by using this block to make them more prominent and to increase the duration. We can also include gestures within an utterance by choosing the gesture block here from the utterance menu. So let's do that as well. Let's make a smile. Hello, how are you? Perhaps we should do a brow raise there to emphasize this is a question. Let's use this one. We can also add in some pauses. Perhaps we want to add a delay here, 400 milliseconds. And maybe we can include another kind of gesture, maybe a little wink here. Let's add another smile. Nice to meet you. Maybe we'll do it a shorter one, perhaps. This is then also, I guess, part of the art of creating skill of creating this natural expression of the robot. Let's add a last brow frown over here, perhaps, after a question. Brow raise. All right, in the next step, we will add actions to attend the user and respond when a user enters. So we will need to use another user trigger here for user enters. So let's jump back to Blockly and make some space and make sure that let's add a new state that we will call greeting. And let's move all the greeting stuff to here and all the other stuff to here. So when we start interaction, we will be in the start state, and right now nothing will be happening there. So then let's add a trigger for when a user enters. We want to then transition to the greeting state. But we also maybe want to make sure that if the interaction starts and the user is already present, we also want to go to the greeting state. So let's add a control function here in this control block. And as the condition, if we can choose a condition here for if has users. So if there's a user present, then we want to transition directly into greeting. Else we will do nothing and just wait for this trigger then to happen. And if we run a little interaction again, we can see that now the interaction will be waiting in this state until we have a user that walks up to the robot.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm amazing.
I think today is going to be a great day. What is your name?
I see that we forgot the most important bit. When we recognize a user, we not only want to start interaction, we also want to make sure that we are attending the user. So we'll add this little block to attend user. We can, I mean, you could either add it into here when we start the state greeting, or I think I prefer to add them here. Right now we have no handlers for what happens when a user leaves, but maybe we can add that on a little bit later on. And instead, let's continue on with the next step, which is to give the interaction some character, or give the character some flavor. So one thing to start with is simply to select the texture they want to be using, find a voice that we think is suiting for this kind of character, and then maybe we could also change the script a little bit to add some character to it. I kind of like the Brian voice. Is very suitable to sort of nice dry English humor, or fits well with sarcasm. That works very well with the TTS voices that are not always so expressive. So that more sort of deadpan sarcasm usually works pretty good. And also the Ivan face is I think it's a good option because it's a less human-looking face. So typically it's not as intimidating as the more human-like faces are. So let's add these in. Let's make the window a little bit smaller so we can see our virtual Furhat head, the animated head. And we start interaction by adding a virtual user, simply by double-clicking here.
Oh. No, not another meat bag again.
Hello.
How's the saggy lump of meat feeling today?
This saggy lump of meat feel pretty good.
I'm not too bad myself. What is your name?
My name is Nicholas.
Nice to meet you, Nicholas.
All right, nicely done. We have now created an interaction that uses multimodal communication. that is both facial expressions and voice. It has social awareness, that it reacts to users entering and leaving the interaction space. And it has somewhat of a character also. Next up, you can choose if you want to keep on working with this little interaction and polish it and explore more of what thing you can do to make the interaction more robust and just a better interaction overall. Or perhaps you want to try out creating a completely different interaction. In the zip file that you have access to, there is also a folder here for some inspirational things. So we have a fruit seller skill, which is mimicking the fruit seller tutorial that we have for when you are learning how to program the robot using the Kotlin skill API. When we have like a guess a number, a knock joke, prisoner's dilemma that is using a graphical user interface. So next example of that, true or false game, etc. So feel free to check those out and try to create your own little interaction. But in this video, I will talk then a little bit more about sort of other things to consider. So when you talk about initiative, that's an important part of the interaction. How is the interaction initiated? We added the triggers here for when a user enters. You might consider when the user hasn't entered, the robot will just be sort of staring blankly into space. You might consider them transitioning to some kind of idle state. In the idle state you see here, it's a very, very, very simple one. It doesn't do anything sort of randomly. It just stares blankly and waiting for a user to enter. But here you can experiment with adding some random behavior, maybe some timings, after 20 seconds or 30 seconds, the robot might look around and try to catch the attention of someone who's in the neighborhood. Another thing to make sure in your interaction is that you have a proper end state, that you end the interaction in a good way. The interaction we just ran didn't really end in any place. Just said, "What's your name?" And after you said your name, it says, "Nice to meet you," and then it just cuts off. So maybe it needs to end with, "Anyway, it's been nice talking to you, but I'm going to zone out. I'll see you around." And maybe the robot should close its eyes and turn down its head and sort of pretend to fall asleep. Or however you want to make sure that it's the interaction is terminated in a nice and controlled way. Or perhaps in other kind of interaction, maybe you want to loop back to the beginning again and wait for a new user to come. To make the robot sort of natural and delighting, it's important to add more of this random behavior and random movements. There are a couple of building blocks to do so. Let's go into the Blockly flow and check them out. So in the trigger other, we can trigger things to happen randomly. And a good place where you can place these is in the state, the built-in state that's called flow init. Here we can define some global behavior that we want to be happening regardless of what state we're in. So here we could, for example, add some random movements of the robot from time to time. So maybe we can take this one. So between every, let's say 8 seconds, or randomly somewhere between 8 and 12 seconds, the robot would look at a random place. Let's attend random angle. Minus 50, and 50 is the max range. Let's go with a little more subtle movement. So look either left or right. And maybe a little bit up as well. And then we will attend the user again. So this will add some random behavior to the robot. It will break eye contact at every 8 to 12 seconds, some around that, and look away somewhere, and then attend the user again. I think we should add a wait here, so it should attend somewhere else and maybe look there for 1.5 seconds and then attend the user again. So adding these random movements is very important. It's also very important to make sure that the variation of the speech is randomized, so you don't come across the same repetitive utterances over and over. And we can use this random block to make the speech more varied. Either we can use this random block, and in this random block then we can define anything. So let's use this one for our random movement here. So let's say we will either look to the left and down, or randomly we will look or let's do it like this. We will randomly look to the left but never in the center, or we'll randomly look to the right, but never in the center. We can also add randomness into an utterance. So we could, for example, split up an utterance. So maybe we'll say, I didn't quite hear you. So this will make the robot randomly say either I didn't quite hear you or I didn't quite catch your name. I don't really care anyway, so I'm just going to call you my meatbag. And this is especially important then for utterances that are repeated more than once in interaction. So for example, if you would have some error handling, let's add maybe some general error handling that we can have in interaction. So when a user says something that we don't understand, then we would want to ask them again. And perhaps we want to, instead of doing the built-in, sorry, I didn't hear that, can you say it again? We will say a simple or let's do some different variants. Perhaps, sorry. We can also nest these, so we'll get more options. What did you say? And you can imagine how you can combine this and play around with this to get some more variation into your interaction. If you want to keep exploring, I have also a version of the interaction here that's called Final Advanced with Comments. That is a little more advanced interaction than what you have seen here. There's also a bunch of comments added in here, so you can, in the flow itself, get reminded of what these different blocks do. So a couple of things to consider if you want to keep working on this skill and make it a little more delightful and a nicer interaction. Some things to consider. So the first thing here is, how is the interaction initiated? The initiative of the interaction is very important. In our interaction, we have it will initiate by a user showing up in front of the robot. But if there are no users, the robot will just be staring blankly into space. So you should really consider having some kind of idle state where the robot might turn to when the interaction has not been initiated yet. In this idle state that you see in the presentation here, it's a very simple one. It doesn't really do anything. So here I advise you to maybe mix in some random behavior of the robot, or perhaps even more advanced behavior by having the robot acting bored, or maybe looking around for a user, trying to get eye contact with someone who's not standing immediately in front of the robot, but is somewhere near it. You might also consider having a mixed type of interaction initiative in the interaction. Where sometimes the robot will be leading the conversation and asking questions, and other times it will have more ask an open question and sort of wait for the user to take command. One important thing to make sure in your interaction is also that you have a natural end state. In the interaction that we've done so far, we didn't really have any end state. It just simply stopped after it asked for your name. So in these more advanced interactions, it will, after asking for your name, it will go to this next state where it presents itself, and then it will end the interaction by saying something like, "Anyway, it's been nice talking to you, but I'm going to zone out for a while now. I'll see you around." And then we will end the state in this zone out state. And in this zone out state, we make sure we're not attending anyone anymore. We're looking at an angle 15 and 20, so we're looking sort of up to the right, I think. And then we will, and that should sort of break the interaction when we break eye contact and look away. And then we have some random movements, and we've also added a wizard button, so we can, from the web interface, restart the interaction by going to start. We also have a trigger here for when the user leaves. We will then first just wait 5 seconds, and then we will return to start if we have no users still around. So feel free to play around and add more things to the interaction to make sure you have a good and natural end state. And a common error is that you too quickly return to the start state again if you want to sort of loop back before you are sure that the user has left. And the tricky part here might be finding that balance between having a user leaves, and then if another user enters straight away, is this a new user or is it the same user who maybe just turned their head for 2 seconds and the robot might have misinterpreted that as the person left. Another important aspect to give to this interaction is to make it even more natural and delighting. And one of the ways of doing this is to make sure to add more random movements and behavior using these random blocks and repeating triggers. So we can see here in my interaction, I've made use of some of these random blocks. So I have created an idle state here. So if the interaction doesn't start immediately, we will go to this idle state. And we first have this random trigger that between 3 and 5 seconds. So every 3 to 5 seconds, we will first attend a random angle, not too sharp angles here. -50 and 50 are the max values of the robot can turn its head. So we'll do a subtle movement, but looking down. So -10 to 0. So looking straight or a little bit down. And then we will either do nothing, or we will do, so 50% of the chances we will do, of the cases we'll do nothing, and 50% of the chances we will do a gesture, a thoughtful gesture, not so strong, a little bit longer, a gaze away gesture, a brow frown gesture, or we will do a double blink, just to add some randomness to the robot's behavior. We have also added some randomness to the robot utterances. So we can say something like, I didn't quite catch that, or I didn't hear you so good. So I'll just call you meatbag or my human, just to make sure the robot doesn't get too repetitive. And this is especially important for the error handling. Let's see if I have added in some randomness in the error handling. No, I haven't. So let's actually do that right now. So I've also added, maybe I should make a note of this. There's a state here called flow init. And this flow init state will trigger when the interaction starts. And it will be active regardless of what state you're in. So you can define some global behavior in this state. So whenever we have users says something, and in the current state it's not defined, we don't have a user says something block in that state, then this user says something block will trigger. So we can use this to override the default error handling. So here I've overridden it to make sure that if user says something that we don't understand, we will just do a simple but let's make sure that we add some random variation to this as well, because we don't want this to become too repetitive. And maybe sometime we want to do, let's do it like this. We will either say a short or sorry, or we will do a little bit longer. We will add, what was that? And perhaps you want to add some randomness for that question as well. So what was that? Or perhaps, what did you say? So you can see you can nest these these building blocks. So you can create add this randomness to the utterances. And remember to keep the dialogue short. Avoid sort of mechanical dialogue. That's typically important thing to consider when writing dialogue for the social robots like this. We can also make sure to just add more pauses and facial expressions, and typically testing, and adding and changing the different delays, and trying out different gestures to get a feeling for what feels right. Another thing to mention there about character is that the robot always has a character. If you don't give the robot a character, it's going to get the default character, and that's the bland and boring character. So make sure that you always have that in mind. It doesn't have to be a quirky and funny, sarcastic character like I did. You know, it could be a professional character, or it could be someone that is just a friendly character, but always have that in mind. Another thing is to try to throw in something that might surprise the user a bit. Getting them to react and perhaps getting a little smile can do wonders for the engagement that people have with the interaction. So simply by calling their meat bag, for example, you never sort of fails to put a smile on people's face. Another thing that I mentioned briefly before is to use the built-in state flow init to set sort of global commands and global behavior. So you can do some more robust error handling and recovery, and to avoid times what we call robot death, where the robot would be unnecessarily repetitive or just stare blankly into space, and that illusion of the robot being alive then is broken. You can also experiment by adding variables to that should trigger when user is silent and so on. So you can set these counters for number of silences, and you can vary the different responses that you want to have for the first or the second time the user is silent. There is example of me doing this in the Blockly flow here. So when user is silent, we will increase this variable silences by 1, and then we can then have a counter here that if the silences exceed a certain number, or if silences is lower than a certain number, then we will repeat the question, but after a threshold has been hit here, we will simply just move on with the conversation. Finally, I want to mention that try to never get stuck anywhere in the dialogue. Always keep the interaction moving using either smart dialogue and the trigger uses as something. They are very useful. And this is especially true for dialogue turns that are not required to complete the task. In our case, the greeting and asking for how are you doesn't really take us anywhere in interaction. Maybe the most important part is asking for the person's name. Another few tips and tricks that I can send with you on your continued exploration of the Furhat robot or the virtual robot. To use the test selected button to try out how something sounds. Especially useful when you have perhaps these more complex building blocks.
I didn't hear you so good. So I'll just call you meatbag.
And you can try out a couple
I
of
didn't
these
hear you
to
so
make sure
good.
it always
So I'll just call you
good.
meatbag.
Another thing is when you're finding a face and a voice, you can use the main tab in the web interface to try out different ones and find the one that you like. Another tip for you when you're creating interactions is to use the call transition and immediate terminate to create functions essentially in the Blockly flow. So the example you see here is I created a state which I call briefly look away. And I have defined there that I will stop attending and then I will look away, wait for 1.2 seconds and then attend the user again and then will terminate. And I can then call this state. And the difference here between doing a call and a go to is when I call the state, I will perform the actions and then when the state has finished and has been terminated, I'll return to where I was before. Whereas if I go a go to, I will transition to this state and I will not be able to return to where I was before. And this function can then be used for creating these functions essentially. But you can also use them for the regular subflows, etc. if you want to perhaps have a yes, no, or a confirm state where you can ask a yes, no question that you will be using multiple times in your interaction. And after the user said yes or no, you want to return to where you were in the interaction. Then using this call transition is the way to go. I think it's time to wrap up this digital workshop. I hope you had a great time building a little social interaction with the virtual Furhat robot. And before I leave you, I would like to just mention a couple of things of the Blockly tool that you have been using. So Blockly tool is currently in beta. So while you're exploring the Blockly tool, you might find one or two of these building blocks that might not function as you expect them to. Or you will definitely find some rooms for improvement of this tool. Or just in general, you might encounter, the limitations of this way of programming the robot with a visual programming interface like this. And the Blockly tool is one of the ways you can create interactions for the Furhat robot. The preferred way is perhaps the Kotlin skill API, where you have all the powers of a regular programming language to create delightful and fantastic experiences with the robot. We have also recently released a remote API where you can create interactions for the Furhat robot using other programming languages, for example, Python. So we hope that this little tutorial that you did today was just your first step of trying out the Furhat robot platform. And I hope this was a good, nice intro for you to keep exploring what the Furhat robot can do. Again, I hope you had a great time doing this digital workshop, and if you have any questions, comments, feedback, we'd be happy to hear from you, so please reach out to us through social media or send us an email. All right, have a good day, and as always, don't forget to smile, all right?